Yesterday, the Department of Homeland Security announced that Venezuelans could now apply for something called temporary protected status in the United States. This temporary protected status will help Venezuelans March 9th of this year through September 9th of 2022. It's an 18-month period. This will also help Venezuelans who have something called deferred enforced departure. But if you already have deferred enforced departure, you are encouraged to apply again for temporary protected status. In today's video, we want to talk a little bit about just what is temporary protected status, what its advantages, what will it get you, how do you apply, what are the fees, can you get a fee waiver request, and maybe some of the reasons that you would not qualify for temporary protected status. So let's first talk about what is temporary protected status, or TPS. Temporary protected status, commonly called TPS, is a protected status that immigration can give to people who cannot return to their home countries because of civil strife or because of some kind of natural disaster. For example, an earthquake, a military coup, something that makes your country unsafe for you to return to. If you have temporary protected status, then you are not removable from the United States. They will not put you into deportation proceedings simply because you are here. You can lose temporary protected status for certain criminal convictions, but generally speaking, if you have temporary protected status, you are protected from deportation. What temporary protected status isn't, is it is not a mechanism to get lawful permanent residency or a green card. It's not what's called an immigrant visa. It is simply something to protect you while your country is unsafe. Immigration can end temporary protected status when and if it's safe for people to return to their home countries. Generally speaking, it's given for a period of 18 months. Usually it is renewed right before the designated 18-month period ends. Now let's talk about some of the advantages of getting temporary protected status. The first advantage is that you're not deportable. If you have a valid legal status, such as temporary protected status, immigration will not put you into deportation. Another advantage is that you can apply for an employment authorization document, which is what most of us call a work permit. And if you have a work permit, you can then apply for a Social Security card. In the state of Wisconsin, if you have a valid legal status, like TPS, you can also apply for a state ID or you can apply for a driver's license. Finally, one big advantage is permission to travel. If you apply for something called advanced parole, and if immigration grants you advanced parole, then you can use that to travel abroad. You can leave the United States and you can re-enter. If you get advanced parole as someone with temporary protected status, when you come back to the United States, you come back in the exact same temporary protected status. So you leave with temporary protected status and you return with temporary protected status. But there is one big advantage. In the future, if you were to qualify for lawful permanent residency or green card, oftentimes if you have a legal entry, it's much easier to get lawful permanent residency than if you have an unlawful entry. That's not true of all immigrant visas, but it is true of many. So if you have advanced parole and you leave and re-enter, make sure that one day, if you apply for lawful permanent residency, you let your immigration attorney know that you have the lawful entry. Now let's talk a little bit about who qualifies. To get temporary protected status for Venezuelans, first of all, you have to be Venezuelan. You have to be a citizen or national of Venezuela, or you can be someone who has no nationality, but who last resided in Venezuela. Secondly, you have to be physically present in the United States since March 9th of this year and continuously resided in this country since March 8th of this year. And that's generally because that's when they announced that temporary protected status was being granted to Venezuelans, and they don't want people coming to the United States to get temporary protected status who aren't already here. One important thing about temporary protected status is if you have certain misdemeanors, certain criminal convictions, you cannot get temporary protected status. So it's really important, if you've had any contact with law enforcement, that you talk to a good immigration attorney who can walk you through if your criminal conviction is a kind of criminal conviction that will stop you from getting temporary protected status. Again, once you apply, you are going to send immigration your fingerprints. They're going to have a digital scan of your face. They're going to know where you live. So temporary protected status, like most things, is something you want to make sure you're going to get before you apply for it. So now let's talk a little bit about how you actually apply for temporary protected status. Like most things with immigration, there's a form and a fee. The form is called an I-821. Now, there are two forms that are an I-821. There's an I-821 and an I-821D. You want the I-821. You are not required to apply for a work permit, but many people want a work permit. And if you want the work permit, you also have to fill out another form called an I-765 and pay the fee. We'll talk about the fees in a minute. One strange thing about work permits is even if you're a baby and you're too young to work, you might want to get a work permit at least once so that you can get the Social Security number. Because remember, a work permit is what lets you get a Social Security number. And even if you're really little, having a Social Security number can make your life a little bit easier. You will fill out the forms. You will mail them off to immigration. There's a specific mailing address for temporary protected status. There is one mailing address for the state of Florida, and there's one mailing address for the rest of the United States. But make sure you send it to the correct address. We normally mail things returned receipt requested, which is a little bit more expensive, but you do have a way to track and know that immigration has received your package. Then you want to make sure that you watch for any receipt notices that come back from immigration. They'll have a unique number. And if you move, it's really important that you advise immigration of your new address. Eventually, they're going to ask you to go to immigration for something called a biometrics appointment, which is where they will scan your face and take a digital fingerprint. If you don't get those notices and if you don't go, they will deny your application for not going to the biometrics appointment. So it's important that they know if you move. It is also where they're going to send your work permit. So that is important that they know where to send the correct mailing address, so they send the work permit to the correct address. Let's talk a little bit about when you can apply. You can apply right now. You can apply starting now, but immigration wants to get your application within something called the initial registration period, which means the first 180 days. Immigration wants applications received by September 5th of 2021. There is something called delayed initial registration, but it gets complicated and it's not automatic. If you don't apply within the first 180 days, that's not an application you can do yourself. You're going to need to find someone who can help you through and explain why you didn't timely apply in the first 180 days. Now let's talk about the costs associated with filing for temporary protected status. The first time you apply for temporary protected status, there's a $50 filing fee. That means all Venezuelans will have to pay the $50 filing fee because it's the first time Venezuela's been eligible to apply for temporary protected status. If you choose to apply for an employment authorization document, there's a $420 fee. But that only applies to people who are between the ages of 14 and 66. If you are younger or older than that, then you do not have to pay the fee for the employment authorization document. But you still might want to get one even if you're not working, just because that's how you get a Social Security number. There will also be an $85 filing fee, which is really for the biometrics. That's where immigration is going to take a digital scan of your face and they're going to take a digital fingerprint so they can run security checks. If you are at or below 150% of the federal poverty level, you can apply for a fee waiver for all the costs associated with temporary protected status. But you will need to prove that you're at or below 150% of the federal poverty level. Lastly, we're going to talk about what happens after this initial 18-month period with temporary protected status. One of two things will happen. Either immigration will decide that it is still too dangerous for people to be able to return to Venezuela, or immigration will decide that it is now safe for people to return to Venezuela. If immigration decides it's not safe, they can extend temporary protected status. They can extend it for usually 18-month periods, but there's no time limit on how long you can have temporary protected status. If immigration decides, immigration can allow temporary protected status to go on for years. If immigration ends temporary protected status, then anyone with temporary protected status will revert to whatever status they had before applying. For example, if you applied for asylum and then also applied for temporary protected status, if your temporary protected status ends, you'll go back to someone with an asylum application pending. If you have here with no immigration status, then you'll go back to seeing someone with no immigration status. If you came as a tourist and stayed too long, you'll be back to being a tourist who stayed too long. But one thing to keep in mind, everyone is so focused on getting the work permit that sometimes they forget to apply for the temporary protected status. You only get the work permit because you have the temporary protected status. If you only apply for the work permit and forget to apply for the temporary protected status, you won't get either. You won't get the work permit or the temporary protected status. I know this is really confusing, and the nice thing about watching the videos is that you can watch this more than once. But if you have any questions, make sure to find a good immigration attorney who can help walk you through all of your options in terms of applying for temporary protected status.